Sophie, and today I will do a book review on the book The Twits by ROALD DAHL. The two main characters of this book are Mr. and Mrs. Twit. Let's talk about Mr. Twit first. Mr. Twit, as you can see, was one of those hairy-faced men with a beard and a thick mustache. Now, usually when you go in a restaurant and see a hairy-faced man, you will notice that whenever he eats, even if he opens his mouth very wide, food will always be sticking to his beard. Now, with us, if there was food around our mouth, we can just use a napkin and wipe it off. But this is not so with a hairy-faced man, as ROALD DAHL says. And it's not so for Mr. Twit either. Most hairy men and other people all wash themselves up, wash their faces, all kinds of stuff like that, to clean their beards, I suppose. But this is not so with Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit did not clean his beard at all. So you can imagine how many food little bits were sticking in his beard. And you probably wouldn't hold your nose if you ever came too close to him. But that is enough about Mr. Twit for now. Let's talk about Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She was a very ugly person, and I will find a picture for you. See this? This is her. See how ugly she is? Now, it is a pity that she did not have a hairy face, because as ROALD DAHL says, if she had a hairy face, it would have covered up most of her ugliness. But she did not have a hairy face. But the truth is, this Mrs. Twit was not born as ugly, as ROALD DAHL says. ROALD DAHL said that when she was born, she had quite a nice face, but she had ugly thoughts. And as he says, ugly thoughts, if you think about them, they will always show on your face. And if you have ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, you will become very ugly. You see, a person with nice thoughts can never be ugly. You may have a stick-out teeth, or a crooked nose, or even a double chin, but you can never look as hideous and ugly as Mrs. Twit. Now, these two hags were very horrible, and Mrs. Twit had a glass eye, too. If you're wondering what a glass eye is a sort of eyeball, but it's not a real one, thank goodness. But you can pop this eyeball in and out of your eye socket anytime you want. There are many tricks with this glass eye, as you can pop it in and out. And you can bet your life on it that Mrs. Twit knew all of these nasty tricks. Now, Mrs. Twit also had a walking stick. You might think someone as old as Mrs. Twit would use a walking stick to help her get around, but no siree. She used this walking stick to beat up little children and animals such as dogs and cats. Now, remember when I said Mrs. Twit had a glass eye and she knew all these kinds of tricks to play with it? Well, I was right, because guess what? She decided to put a glass eye in Mr. Twit's cup. And you can imagine what a nasty shock it must have been for Mr. Twit. See that little mug that Mr. Twit is holding? There's a little eyeball in it, and that's Mrs. Twit's glass eye. Now, Mr. Twit, do not feel bad for him. Mr. Twit was evil. He decided, and to pay back for Mrs. Twit, he decided to put a frog in her bed. Yuck, right? I wouldn't like a frog being in my bed at night. Would you? So you can see that these two people were very horrible to each other. I shudder to think about them. But they are not just horrible to each other. They are horrible to other people, or rather other animals, like monkeys. Now, what would monkeys be doing in Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house, you ask? Well, you see, in the old days, ROALD DAHL says that Mr. and Mrs. Twit were monkey trainers. These two evil monkey trainers were retired now, but Mr. Twit wanted to have a great upside-down circus one day. And you see, he made the monkeys stand upside down for hours and hours and hours. They had to be play football upside down. They had to eat and drink upside down, which is nearly impossible, as food and water have to go up the throat when they're upside down and not go down the throat, which would mean the food would be defying gravity. But anyway, these monkeys had to do everything upside down for hours and hours. So they hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit, and I would have too if I were the monkeys. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Twit were also horrible to birds. Instead of just eating chickens and ducks and that kind of stuff, they ate any kind of bird they could catch. And how did they catch these birds, you ask? They catch these birds by smearing some glue called hug-tight glue on a tree. You see, birds always like to land on trees for the night to roost. But this tree was a dangerous tree to roost on, especially on Tuesday evenings. You see, the glue would hold the birds on the tree forever and ever until Mr. Twit came and plucked them off and put them in his basket for bird pie. This must have been horrible for the birds, and it would have been horrible for me too if I were one of those birds. My favorite character of this book is the Roly-Poly bird. The Roly-Poly bird is a very good bird. This bird is very pretty. It also comes from Africa, just like the monkeys. Now, you can see that this bird has many feathers and puffed and poofed, and I really like them. But my favorite thing is that the Roly-Poly bird comes up with a song to keep the birds safe. It says, "There's sticky stuff all over the tree. If you land in the branches, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." I like it because of the rhymes. It's like poems. My favorite part of this book is very funny. You see, you know how Mr. Twit spread glue on the tree? Well, it turns out that there are problems with that. Let me just find the picture. You see, there are 4 little boys who climbed up the tree at the evening time, and there they stuck. And then one very clever boy thought, we're just stuck by the seats of our pants. See, if we unbutton our pants, well, I needn't say no more, as you can see in this picture that their naked bottoms are glinting in the light. Now, I think that part was very funny. You can imagine how funny it was for seeing a little boys running around with their naked bottoms, but this was not funny for Mr. Twit, no siree. He was mad as mad could be. The boys had scared away his bird pie, and he was just about to make boy pie. But unfortunately for him, there was no kind of pie for him. And luckily for everybody, Mr. and Mrs. Twit met a horrible end. The least favorite part of this book is when they show a picture of the bird pie that Mrs. Twit makes, because I do feel sorry for the birds. But luckily, Mr. and Mrs. Twit do meet a horrible end, but I'm not going to tell you, just so I can save the fun for you when you read this book. I really like this book because it's humorous and I like the animals in it. So I recommend you to read this book if you like humor stories and other Roald Dahl stories. Thank you for watching. Bye!